Gracie Jiu Jitsu rocks. Welcome to the Gracie Jiu Jitsu Rocks podcast, a podcast dedicated to Gracie Jiu Jitsu and all things Gracie, including self-defense, competition, anti-bullying, women's self-defense and empowerment, nutrition, and most especially, the people involved in Gracie Jiu Jitsu. This podcast is for the average Joe. It's for anyone who practices, trains, teaches, or just loves to talk about or hear about Gracie Jiu Jitsu. We'll explore the lives of Gracie Jiu Jitsu practitioners, how they got involved in the art, and what effect it's had on their lives. So buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to episode 127 of the Gracie Jiu Jitsu Rocks podcast. As always, I'm your host, Marty Josie, and thanks for listening. Today my guest will be Matt Thornton, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but before we do, let's start off with our quote. And that quote is, "To survive is to win." And that's from Master Rickson Gracie. It's short and sweet, but a profound message indeed. So I hope everyone is staying well and safe during this crazy time in our world. Hopefully it will be over sooner rather than later, and we can all get back to doing as much jiu-jitsu as we want. Until then, hang in there, everybody. All right, so Matt Thornton is the founder, CEO, and head coach of Straight Blast Gym. He's been involved in the martial arts for over 30 years. Matt has worked with some of the best MMA fighters, grapplers, and combat athletes in the world, including UFC Hall of Famers Randy Couture, Dan Henderson, Forrest Griffin, and others. Matt was one of the early group of Americans to become involved in the art of jiu-jitsu, having been introduced to it in 1991. He was also the first person from the state of Oregon to receive a black belt in the art. As a teacher, he produced a video set in 1999 titled simply Aliveness, which became one of the top sellers of all time within the industry. It set off a firestorm of controversy and remained a central catalyst in a martial arts training revolution that has taken place all over the world over the decades. Today, he spends his time teaching and running SBG International, an international organization that has produced some of the world's best mixed martial arts champions, BJJ teachers, and self-defense coaches. SBG has more than 70 locations and more than 100 affiliate black belts, and some of the world's most sought-after instructors. Matt has awarded over 30 black belts himself, and many have gone on to accomplish great things within the sport. People like John Kavanagh, coach of UFC legend Conor McGregor. Now, I've been looking forward to interviewing Matt for some time now, as I'm a big fan of his work. He's a very intelligent person who has deep insight into so many facets of martial arts, including a vast knowledge of martial arts history. In this interview, we discuss several subjects, including his start in martial arts, serving in the Army, his size, and has that ever affected or dictated his martial arts style, meeting Fabio Santos and meeting Rickson Gracie for the first time. The biggest thing about martial arts and jiu-jitsu that people tend to miss or just don't get. Training under Chris Haugter, Aliveness, having solid fundamentals, Henry Akins' recent move to SBG, and Henry's impact on his training. His unique approach to teaching seminars, the most interesting book he's read in the past year, being a father as a younger man and being a father as an older man, and much more. So I know you're going to enjoy this interview. After the interview, make sure you stick around for the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment. And now, without further ado, let's talk to Matt. All right, I'm speaking with Matt Thornton, founder, president, and CEO of Straight Blast Gym International. So welcome, Matt, and thank you for taking time to speak with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My honor indeed, sir. So you've been in the game for a long time, meaning you've been around in martial arts for many, many years, had a very interesting life in the martial arts. So want to cover quite a few things, but let's just start by giving us a brief background of your martial arts journey. Like, how did you get started in martial arts, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I think like a lot of kids, I think I started martial arts with traditional karate, which I only did for about a year when I was I believe it was 8 or 9 years old, and I always loved martial arts. Started to get involved more when I left the Army. So when I got out of the military, I knew I wanted to take up martial arts when I got back home, and I'd done quite a bit of research, and the conclusion I'd come to is I wanted to try boxing, give it a shot, and then I also wanted to work some grappling. And I had in my mind a kind of training that would look more like what we have as MMA. And at the time, the closest thing to that, and this would have been the late 80s, was Jeet Kune Do concepts that I could find, because to me it looked like they were using boxing hands, and I liked the idea of what they talked about being able to fight at all the different ranges. So when I left the military, I took up training in Jeet Kune Do concepts. I trained for about a year and a half in California, and then I moved to Portland and kept training for a couple more years. I started teaching with another instructor, Jeet Kune Do instructor. We opened up a school, and probably a year after that, maybe 9 months after that, I had my first introduction to Gracie Jiu Jitsu, courtesy of Fabio Santos, who put an ad in the newspaper asking for people he would pay you to come try and beat him up. And I was getting beat up every day at the boxing gym for free, so I thought I'd give it a shot. Exactly what you imagine would happen. He took me down, mount, rear naked choke, and I loved it. I immediately loved it. And Fabio turned out to be a nice guy, and so I immediately started taking lessons with him. And somewhere around that time, this is so long ago, I've forgotten the exact sequence of it, but I also got to meet Rickson Gracie, who was doing a seminar for a friend of mine in a place called Eugene, Oregon. And, this was so long ago that I think there was a total of 20 people there, and they were all judo people. So that tells you, because obviously now if Rickson puts on a seminar, you're going to have, cap it at like 300 or 400 people. And when I showed up, I was late. And I watched him, and he was Ironmaning, rolling with every person in the room, one after the other. And after a couple of people, I realized he wasn't using his hands at all, just
wow.
And so I jumped in there. He pulled one arm out. He's like, "For you, my big friend, I'll take one arm out," which he didn't need it, but arm locked me, and effortlessly. And I was 100% hooked at that point. I think Rickson could tell I was hooked. Fabio could tell I was hooked. I think Fabio said, "You have the jiu-jitsu bug now. You're never going to be able to get rid of it." And I went back to the school I was training at, and I tried to get some of the other instructors, excited the way I was about this, and they were all very skeptical. And I kind of came to the conclusion over a period of time that they didn't have the same motives as me, really, in terms of training, which is fine, but we were going different directions. So I opened up my first school in a place called Salem, Oregon. And I believe that was 1992. And so that was the official start of SBG.
Awesome. And so before you go any further with that, I definitely want to get into that. Let's back up a little bit. You covered a lot of stuff really quickly. I just wanted to ask you about a few things. Starting with the Army. What did you do in the Army?
11 Bravo. I was a grunt. And I was in Berlin. So I was part of the Berlin Brigade before the wall came down.
Wow. I bet that was an exciting time to be over there.
It was an exciting time. I actually missed they had just started opening up parts of the border, and people were flooding out. But they actually sent me home just before the wall came down, so I missed the big party. But it was a good experience for an 18-year-old kid.
Absolutely. Did you do any arts while you were in the Army, or?
I did a little boxing.
Okay.
Nothing formal. I didn't have any matches or anything like that, but they had a little bit of boxing on the base that I would do.
Okay. And then with your JKD concepts, is that where the name Straight Blast come from? That
it does. So initially, when at the time, I was fairly disillusioned in a sort of cynical way with Jeet Kune Do. I had gravitated towards it because I thought it was going to be something like what MMA became. And after a while, I became fairly cynical about some of the instructors, about what they were teaching. Some of what they were teaching was functional, of course, the kickboxing, the wrestling, and some of the guys were far ahead of the typical martial arts for the time. People like Larry Hartzell, who even back in the 70s and early 80s was advocating for the right stuff. But then they would do other things that were just silly, like a lot of the Penjak Silat, a lot of the Filipino martial arts stuff. The patterns were while on one hand they were claiming to have superior delivery systems to traditional martial arts, on the other hand they were always sneaking in a bunch of equally ridiculous traditional martial arts. So I became pretty cynical about that. And when I opened up my own gym, the initial philosophy behind SBG was pretty much just contrarian to everything I'd seen in Jeet Kune Do. So we weren't going to have any titles. We weren't going to have any uniforms. We weren't going to hand out certificates. I wanted it wasn't called an academy or an institute, which most of the schools were called at the time. Instead, I called it a gym, very intentionally, because in my mind, it was a place where people would show up and you would leave class. It would be an athletic workout, and you would test yourself, and you would leave class sweating. It's not the type of thing where you're going to get together, click sticks together, and compare notes. So my vision was a gym, and my idea was we were going to take everything we had learned, my curriculum, and we were going to filter it through full contact at the gym. And one of the only real Jeet Kune Do techniques that we kept was the straight blast. It was modified very quickly to a boxing blast, which is basically what you would see Vitor Belfort do in his initial UFC fights. But I kept that name combined with the word gym to kind of get across the idea of what we were all about, what we were doing.
I think that's pretty cool, because I know a lot of people, if they were in their evolution, along the martial arts journey, if they change dramatically, a lot of times they feel like they've got to change the name of something they're doing. But I like how you stayed with that, but just continued to search for truth, so to speak.
Yeah, one thing I've always been very careful of was after I opened up my first school, we brought Rickson back for a seminar, and he stayed for a couple weeks actually up here in Oregon, about 10 days, I think. And did the seminar, and then he did private training every day. And at that time, when he gave me my blue belt on that trip, and he told me he said, go ahead and teach what you know so you can build up your students so you can get better, because at the time, that's all I was trying to do was, create training partners. But make sure that you call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Don't call this Jeet Kune Do. Don't call this any other kind of martial art, because at the time, there was a lot of people who were taking what the Gracies were teaching and just changing the name. So whenever I teach, of course, I'm not saying what I'm teaching is Jeet Kune Do. I'm saying what I'm teaching is exactly what it was. It's the jiu-jitsu I learned from my coaches.
Nice. Now, you mentioned that Rickson referred to you as my big friend. You're what, 6'8"?
Yeah.
That's big,
yeah,
all right.
I was a lot thinner back then. I was probably 230 at the time, and now I'm last 25 years I've been about 270, but it's probably about 30 or 40 pounds lighter back then, but still, quite a bit heavier than him. I imagine he was probably about 180 at the time.
Yeah. And being that big, being 6'8", did you find that you had to alter anything you was learning as far as like techniques? Did you have to adapt them in any special way for your big frame?
Not really. The thing I've recognized about jiu-jitsu and all functional martial arts is that the fundamentals tend to be the same. So whether I'm teaching my wife, who's a small, petite woman, or a large athlete that's more the same size as me, when I'm really focused on fundamentals, mechanically they tend to be done the same way. If there was a more efficient way to do it, I would do it myself that way as a heavyweight, But then through rolling, you develop your own style. And of course, everybody's they're part of what helps you navigate the moves that you do and don't do is the way you're built. I think it has less to do with your style than your personality does, but still, being tall, there'd be certain types of movements that I would gravitate more towards, like, for example, a triangle than maybe somebody who was shorter or stockier would. So there's always plus and minuses. There's a negative aspect too to being so long in terms of being able to protect your limbs sometimes or your neck, and then there's a lot of positive aspects in terms of reach. So, one of the awesome things, as you know, about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is it really does, over time, the process of training, your body figures out how to move best kind of on its own there.
That's true. Talk a little more about what you just said about the personality coming into play.
I remember actually when I first noticed this, but within a year or so after I first got my black belt, I was doing a seminar in Europe, and we had a lot of the SBG coaches were there, other black belts were there. And I was noticing at the social on the weekend after the classes were over, I was watching them navigate the social environment, and some of the single guys were trying to talk to girls and vice versa, or they were just socializing with each other in the restaurant bar area. And I noticed that it was very much how they roll, So I do think people's temperament, their personality, plays a larger role in the end with the kind of particular style you play of jiu-jitsu than does your body, your body length or your weight. Now, they both matter, but I do think temperament tends to be something you can correlate better to particular individual style.
Yeah, I've always found that really interesting that you can observe that, and it's quite often very reflective of someone on or off the mat. It's very interesting. So back to your journey, you've been training a lot with Rickson, and where'd that lead you from there?
Yeah, I wouldn't say a lot. I didn't have a ton of access to Rickson, so he was one of my first. He was my second person I ever trained with after Fabio, and that was great because I got in, to see jiu-jitsu from the person who I think is the best example of jiu-jitsu. And then I got to train with him for that 10-day, 11-day period after that. And I saw him a couple other times, but generally speaking, after I had that seminar up here in Oregon, he became very hard to train with or reach, at least for me, because I lived in Oregon. I had, 2 tiny kids I was trying to take care of, and he was fighting in Japan. So he was very often not at the academy or overseas. So I then met Chris Haugter on one of my trips down to Los Angeles. And Chris was one of the first American black belts, and he was, I think, a brand new black belt, or within a year or so of being a black belt when I met him. And we got along really well. He was super open to teaching everything. I just really liked him, and so I didn't have a coach because Rickson wasn't accessible really for me, and so he became my coach after that for my purple, brown, and black, and I've been with Chris since then. And funny enough, Chris's first jiu-jitsu instructor was also Rickson. He trained with Rickson in the garage days, and I think the only reason why he wound up going with Higgin Machado is that when they all broke up from Hornian's garage, Higgin happened to be the last guy he got a private lesson with, so he was kind of assigned to Higgin. Plus, he liked him. But so yeah, Chris was my main coach after that.
And you were his first black belt, is that right?
Yes.
Wow, that's quite an honor.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah, he's a great guy, and at the time he was single too, and I had a young family, and he could come up here. I'd bring him up to Oregon, and he'd just stay for 2 weeks, stay at my house, train every single day, a couple times a day. He would always roll with anybody. I had a lot of high-level wrestlers that were training with me at the time, and some of the jiu-jitsu black belts would be wary of training with him for various reasons. Sometimes it was just politics. They didn't want to get in trouble with their coaches back in Los Angeles. And Chris just never cared about that stuff. So he would get on the mat with anybody, roll with anybody, and it was, I learned a lot from him over those years.
So how did this lead you to starting SBG? I guess you'd already started SBG. Tell us how that kind of evolved and what that's been like.
Sure. So I started my school. I threw away everything that wasn't working. All of the what I refer to as dead patterns, sclerotic traditions, things that just weren't functional. We wound up with a core curriculum that was essentially boxing, some Muay Thai, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu from Rickson and then Chris. And I met Randy Couture, who came to my gym right after he had won his first UFC as an alternate. And he came to my gym to train, and I started training with Randy for 3 or 4 years after that on a fairly regular basis. And Randy brought to us what I think was the missing element in the SPG curriculum at the time, which was high-level clinch. Mm-hmm. So we had the clinch material from Rickson, which is great, and we had some, double necktie movement from Muay Thai, which was also good. But Randy brought the full, complement of what you can do with the upper body with underhooks and overhooks and all the correct pressure and angles. And I think that really cemented the curriculum, and from there it wasn't any more about width but more about depth. And as you know, you can spend a lifetime learning Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and just barely begin scratching the surface. So from there it just became about refining the curriculum and especially refining the training methods so they became less rough, better, it's not so hard on the body, and ultimately where we're at now is minimizing, especially for our fighters, brain damage. So we went from, I think, training way too rough back in the early 90s up through probably 2000 to evolving into more thoughtful, functional training methods that are better for people. Where I take a lot of pride in my gym now that anybody, no matter what their background is, athletic or not athletic, can come to my gym, feel welcome, and then be able to train in a way that's going to be safe and healthy for them, which to me is very important. And so that process of getting from where we started, which was a pretty rough, basically just fighting with limited gear on, to where we're at now, where we have training methods where we can help anybody learn jiu-jitsu and learn MMA, has really been the story arc of SPG, I think.
Yeah, that's a great place to end up for sure. I think all the smarter people that are evolving in martial arts and running schools and associations eventually have to get to a place, or hopefully get to a place similar to that, because, in the old days, just being as tough as you could be and the prove it stage, was big. And yeah, there was certainly a reason for that and a need for that. But in today's climate, man, so much better to be able to include all kinds of different people who come to martial arts for different reasons, have different goals, but can certainly grow and evolve in their own right, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if I ask you what the biggest thing about jiu-jitsu or martial arts that people in general miss or misunderstand or just don't get, what would that be?
I think my answer to those would be very, very different. So if you ask me what the biggest thing in martial arts people don't get is, that's going to be a different answer from what people in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu don't get. For what people don't get in martial arts still is aliveness, and that was what I started talking about in 1992. That's still what I talk about now, and that aliveness philosophy forms the core of what we do at SPG. And in short, that's learning how to train in a way where you'll be able to get timing. So you're training with timing, energy, and motion in a functional way. It doesn't mean sparring. It doesn't mean full contact, but it does mean that what you're doing is not in a pattern, and you're getting some resistance. So what happens is you develop a feedback mechanism through the opponent process where you can gather timing. And that's evident in every combat sport, because every combat sport has a goal to win, and anytime the goal to win is there, people turn towards an opponent process type training method so that they can improve. So wrestlers have always done that, of course. Judo people have always done that. But that was my big message to martial arts in general, because for most of the martial arts community, if it's not a combat sport, it really is usually filled with a ton of dead patterns that would do more harm than good in terms of developing someone's fighting skill. And so that's my message to them. To Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, I think my big message now would probably be Rickson's principle of connection, which to me, I think is probably the single most important principle in Jiu-Jitsu. And I only feel like I've been doing Jiu-Jitsu now for about 30 years. I only really feel like I'm starting to get a handle on it now. And I think it's missing in a lot of jiu-jitsu schools.
Yeah, I read a post that you posted recently that said, "This year marks my 30th year of BJJ, my 26th year teaching it full time, and my 19th year as a black belt. Here's what I've figured out so far. No one who really understands how deep the fundamentals in jiu-jitsu go would ever believe they were creating much that was, quote, new. I can honestly say I've gained more understanding about BJJ in the last 3 years than the previous 27, and a large part of that understanding is the recognition of how much I still don't know. The fundamentals run much deeper than a single lifetime allows, and that's part of what makes this art so compelling. All right, it's really cool. Can you expand on that? That's such a great thought.
Yeah, that's 100% sincere, and that's been my experience. And yes, I think, there's a tendency for people to always want the new, quote unquote, and they're always looking for new movements, new techniques as kind of a way to have a leg up on the competition. What's currently fashionable and that the high level competitors are doing. And all those things are cool. All those things are important. And I'm in no way minimizing the value of those things. But what I try and remind people is that underlying that is a structure, foundation of fundamental movements. And those are really the most important aspect of fighting. And mastering those fundamental movements is a lifelong, never-ending process because they run, as I said, they're really, really deep. I mean, the volume of things, jiu-jitsu principles, for example, that are contained in a proper headlock escape, which is one of the first lessons a lot of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu students will learn. But the volume of things contained in that, if you really break it down and think about it and try and do it as efficiently as possible, and by efficient I mean with as little strength, energy, and explosiveness as possible, as little as possible, but no less. And if you're aiming towards that goal of efficiency, and you really break down a headlock escape, and you really understand jiu-jitsu, then you'll see that inside that headlock escape, there's just a deep, vast current of fundamentals that run throughout all of jiu-jitsu. And once you understand that, then you can see those same principles in action in all these other movements. And what I try and get across to my students is understanding those principles and then being able to drill those principles so that you ingrain those human movements is a lot more important than gathering as many techniques as you can. Yeah, I totally
find that just really, really a beautiful and cool thing. And it really shows your depth and insight because it's rare that people, obviously for people that aren't that far along, the tendency is just to, more techniques. But even people that have been in it a long time, they tend to get bored and want new stuff, the latest stuff, or invent something. But having the insight and the depth of seeing the vastness and the richness of the fundamentals, I think is just really, really cool. And it also makes me think of, I know you're not a big fan of the traditional arts, and I agree they certainly have their limitations, but it does remind me of some of the old masters of some of those traditional, like karate, that do the fundamental movements throughout their life and tend to just really see the value throughout their lives. So I'm not saying it's the same in application, but there are similarities in those philosophies.
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of the, if we go back far enough with traditional martial arts, then you're going to run into something functional. I mean, ultimately, jiu-jitsu, as an example, was a battlefield art. And the people that practiced it were practicing it as a matter of life and death. So, of course, they were training in an alive way, and the movements that they were doing were functional. When it stopped becoming a battlefield art and the Japan wasn't a constant battle between warlords of different parts and different regions, and then it became more traditional and put into a pattern. And then it takes someone like the founder of judo to come along and reintroduce aliveness and create and turn it into something that resembles more of a combat sport. And he winds up with a way of training and a bunch of students who are able to then wipe the floor with the rest of the traditional jiu-jitsu practitioners in Japan at the time. And of course, that's where Gracie Jiu-Jitsu came from, is one of his black belts. And the Brazilians took that and modified it even more in what was kind of the perfect petri dish of machismo, and two guys are going to fight, and they're going to fight until one of them submits and nobody's going to shoot him or kick him in the head while that's going on, which is the perfect environment to develop Gracie Jiu Jitsu. And so it goes on from there. But to this day, as you know, of course, the typical 4-stripe white belt in Gracie Jiu Jitsu or blue belt is gonna have a field day with an Aikido black belt or traditional Japanese Jiu Jitsu black belt and wipe the floor with them, despite the fact that that Japanese Jiu Jitsu black belt can probably name many of the movements that the Gracie Jiu Jitsu practitioner is doing. He'll know the names in Japanese. He might even be able to do them in a choreographed way against somebody that's not resisting, that's somebody that's cooperative with him, and make it look really cool for the movies or for television. But when they actually fight, they have no chance because that Gracie Jiu Jitsu 4-stripe white belt or blue belt has timing. They have all this timing that they've learned from the opponent process on the mat. So yeah, I never mean to demean the message of traditional martial arts, the history of traditional martial arts, or the value of many of those traditions, especially a lot of the respect and honor and things that a lot of those traditions still try and uphold. My point has always been related to the training method.
Gotcha. The functionality.
The functionality of it and why it's functional, and the reason why it's functional, it's not the technique, it's the training method. It's very similar to, I have a friend of mine who's a critical thinking professor, and when he's teaching his classes, he always reminds students what's important isn't the answer, what's important is how you arrived at the answer. Mm-hmm. If you understand how you arrived at the answer, then you're going to be able to take that logic, that reasoning, and apply it to different problems. And so it is, with martial arts.
It sounds like it's coming full circle with your philosophy. Like a lot of people, if they don't know the history of a traditional art, and they say someone does some jumping high kick, and they're like, "Well, what's that good for?" Then they learn the environment that was cultivated for, maybe kicking someone off a horse or whatever. Then you find that was very useful for the time, but now it's probably not that useful for today's environment and needs. And so it comes full circle, like what's functional for today, the reality of today's environment and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and one more thing I would caution people on is it doesn't take very long, very quickly, and it's decades, not centuries, after aliveness is taken out of a particular system, where the reality of what was done and the reasons why it was done gets quickly replaced with a lot of stories and mythology. Mm-hmm. The psychic one, I think, is a great example because I've heard that one before, but, have you ridden horses before?
Oh, yeah. I grew up riding them.
There you go. I'm not sure I could ever kick someone off a horse. So if you put me on a battlefield filled with men with spears and swords, and if I get knocked down, they're going to stab me in the face or the belly, which is why takedowns are so important in battlefield arts. I'm not going to run with armor on and do a jumping side kick to somebody on a horse. But within 10 years of either one of us being out of a generation where fighting on horseback is ever done or relevant, we can see how those myths get put into the traditional martial arts. And even the stories of those traditional martial arts are pretty much the same. There's always an instructor who had some disability or a problem, and he had to discover some magic way to overcome all of these issues that he was dealing with, and then he passes it on to his students, but he wants to keep it secret from the other people, so they codify it in forms that no one else knows, And they're remarkably, whether we're talking about Wing Chun or Aikido or any of these martial arts, the mythology and the storyline that they make up after a very short period of time becomes almost identical.
That's very interesting and so true. How do you keep that from happening, though? It seems like it happens with every art, and yep. It's interesting to watch, and not to pick on any one art, but even like I did Taekwondo years ago, and it was basically just to look kind of a game of tag, where at one point in the right environment, I think it was pretty formidable for what it was designed for. And you could say that about any art. Even jiu-jitsu, even Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the more you make it a competition and keep the rules where you can't do this or that, you don't have to worry about protecting, yourself from punches. You don't have to worry about your groin. So you do a lot of different open guard stuff that you may not if someone's really trying to strike you. So I'm not saying it's wrong to train in those environments or for competition and with rules, but I think we can't lose sight of the well-roundedness that we should have as jiu-jitsu practitioners and train not only for competition, but train for strikes or with strikes and other kind of things. It shouldn't be either competitive jiu-jitsu over here or MMA if you want to deal with strikes and grappling. It should be, or not necessarily it should be, it's good if it is. If you look at Hoist in the early UFCs and jiu-jitsu when it came out, it was more as a fighting art. Granted, one-on-one fighting art, but it still had a lot of realism and aliveness in it, if you will, but not so much in a lot of the way jiu-jitsu's evolved.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think as long as jiu-jitsu instructors focus on fundamentals, their students will be able to transcend those environments. Mm-hmm. You know, a headlock escape in class on the mat is not going to be any different mechanically from a headlock escape when somebody's punching you in the face with gloves or in a parking lot in a fight. There are different variables you have to pay attention to, and for example, controlling their hands and things like that. But the actual way, the posture you get so that you have leverage over somebody who's bigger and stronger than you, the connections you have to make with your body, the angles and the pressure in which you execute the movements, those fundamental things are a constant. So if the school is really focused on fundamentals, you can put strikes in a healthy, fun way, you know, whether you're talking about slaps to the head or anything else like that. Yeah. And the vast majority of the students should be able to defend themselves just fine.
What about jiu-jitsu schools or associations that don't train the self-defense aspect, including headlocks and tackles and things like that?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that the headlock escape to me isn't just about self-defense. It's a fundamental mechanic of jiu-jitsu, and if you forget how to do it, and this often happens, I see it all the time because after a while, what happens is we start playing jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu, mm-hmm. which is and that's fun, and that's how you develop your game, and everybody loves that, myself included. But then what we sometimes forget in that process is jiu-jitsu versus the world, jiu-jitsu versus a high school wrestler, jiu-jitsu versus someone who's only done judo. And then when they run into somebody like that, whether it's in a tournament or, you know, in a self-defense situation, and they find themselves in a head and arm of somebody who really knows how to do a head and arm, or a headlock of somebody that really knows how to properly do a headlock, then they could be in trouble. So to me, the mechanics behind a good headlock escape are absolutely core fundamentals for any kind of jiu-jitsu. So I completely agree with what you're saying. I think if a jiu-jitsu school does not focus on fundamentals and instead they teach in a technique by technique fashion, like a series of techniques, and then everybody rolls. Here's how you grip, and the techniques are really the newest thing, the most current fad in the tournaments, different grips, different fancy ways of sweeping and stuff like that. Then those students can definitely find themselves in trouble in an actual fight. But if a school focuses on fundamentals, I think they can still play the IBJJF game. Mm-hmm. They can still do all these same techniques that the current competitors are doing, which are cool and fun. But their students will also be able to defend themselves in a fight. They'll be able to, if they decide they want to try, you know, an MMA fight once in their life or transition to mixed martial arts, they should be able to do that. It shouldn't matter much if they're wearing a gi or they're not wearing a gi. And if it matters a whole bunch, whether you're wearing a gi or you're not wearing a gi, then your jiu-jitsu is not fundamental. So the really core fundamentals of jiu-jitsu transcend the environment. They transcend the uniform. They transcend the era. They transcend geography, right? If I said to you, we're going to do Canadian geometry, you know that sounds ridiculous. Because geometry is the same everywhere in the world, just as there is a most functional way to do a rear naked choke or to escape a headlock. So as long as the students and the coaches have at the core as the majority of what they're serving in the meal be fundamentals, and then you can have whatever else you want on the plate, and I think the students will be able to fight and defend themselves much better actually than I think most people realize, because you know most of us don't get in fights as adults, and my experience with my students has been, you know, on the rare occasion that one of them's had to defend themselves and they're like, wow, jiu-jitsu works really well. And it's like, yeah, you forget how easy jiu-jitsu can be when you're dealing with somebody that doesn't know any jiu-jitsu.
It's a great point. That's a great point because we, like you said, we do get so into jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu and that chess match and the fun part of that. But it is very different than going back and someone who's kind of raw on the street but isn't trained. It's very different.
Right. Absolutely.
So you mentioned as one of the fundamental principles or elements is connection. And of course, Rickson is someone who comes to mind when you talk about connection, but also Henry Akins. And he recently joined the SBG family. So that's quite a nice addition, right? Yes.
No, we're honored to have Henry part of the SBG family, and I should say right now, Henry's had a massive influence on my jiu-jitsu over the last few years. So Henry's in a unique position, I think, because he was with Rickson after Rickson stopped fighting. He's been with Rickson through the whole thing, but he got to spend, I think, a good percentage of time with Rickson after Rickson stopped fighting and decided to put his mind towards teaching a little more. And like a lot of great competitors, this is just my opinion. Henry might have a different opinion on it, but my opinion is that a lot of great competitors, part of why they're great and part of being great is the fact that they don't always 100% know how they do what they do. Their body just responds, and so much of what they do, they assume or they take for granted. Like they'll make little movements with their arm or their elbow, these little details that are actually really important to making the move efficient. But they've done it automatically for so long that when they teach, they may not even mention it, and they'll just take for granted that the student knows that. It'd be like a high-level surgeon taking for granted all the little details of what he has to do to perform heart surgery and just talking about just the main core of what he's doing with the assumption in his mind that all the other people that are watching are also high-level heart surgeons, Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes when competitors like that stop competing and then they focus more on, well, why was I so good? Why could I do it at this level? And then they go back retroactively and seek to explain their methods. And I think that's my opinion is that's what happened with Rickson after he stopped competing. And Henry was there for all of that. And that's when Rickson, my understanding is that's when he started using words like connection, because connection is Rickson's way, I think, of explaining what his body does to other people. And so Henry really got this fantastic time period with Rickson where he got all this material, and he's been a fantastic resource for all of us here in SBG, not just myself, but any of the other coaches have been training with him for a couple of years. And he puts a lot of thought and care into his teaching. And that combined with this fantastic information makes Henry a very valuable person to train with.
Absolutely. I've had my mind blown many times just from watching a video of his, also in private I had with him. But that also speaks to, you got a lot of great people at SBG. People like John Franco, Kane Prevost, Travis Davis, Stephen Whittier. The list goes on and on. I just did an episode with Michael Hines, and it seems like SBG is kind of a hotbed of great minds and great people. So what do you attribute that to? What do you think is the big appeal, and what sets SBG apart?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. I do take a lot of pride in that. To me, that's the most important part of our organization is the quality of instructors that we have and the positive experience people have when they meet and train with them. So I love hearing from people who get to work with, any of the gentlemen you just mentioned or any of our other coaches, and they'll come back and tell me how much, not just that they learn, but how pleasant the experience was, how good the vibe was at the gym, how nice everybody was. So to me, that's the most important thing. As far as what keeps everybody, what kind of unifies everybody, I think SBG is unique in the sense that it's not an organization that's built around a personality. I'm not a famous competitor that's won mundials and people are training with me because they want to learn my jiu-jitsu or because I've medaled so many times. There's nothing like that at all. I'm a jiu-jitsu teacher who's over the years has put a certain degree of thought into what I do and tried to pass that on to my students. And so SBG is an organization that tries to focus on training methods and tries to take a logical empirical approach to Jiu Jitsu and to what we do. And I think people are attracted to SBG, and they remain part of SBG because they are of a similar mind. It's an association of intelligent jiu-jitsu instructors who gather and share that information with each other, and all share common values in terms of how we approach the art and how we like to deal with people. And so I think SBG is unique in that sense. It's not built around one personality or a particular style. It's a group of people who are associated with each other because they share common values and common principles as it applies to martial arts.
Beautiful, beautiful. You also have a pretty unique approach to teaching seminars. You pick one topic and then only teach that for a whole year. So speak a little bit about that. How did that come to be, and why do you take that approach?
Sure. That's only been, the last 4 years. Prior to that, so I started doing seminars, I think probably 1998, 99. I've been doing, 15, 20 a year ever since, all over the world. And usually what I would do for years and years is I'd go and I'd ask the instructor and the students what they want to learn. And then I would do maybe 4 sections. So we'd have some striking, and then we'd do some clinch and takedowns, and then we do maybe some guard passing, and then mount top, or whatever the instructors really wanted. And I'd break it down over 4 sections, and that's good and it's fun. But the problem with that is, going back to what we were talking about earlier, with just how deep the fundamentals go, it's really hard to pass along the fundamentals of any particular position. We're talking about, we'll just take mount top as an example. And then let's just take one type of mount. So low mount, where you're laying, forward more, belly to belly, or hip to hip in that position with your feet underneath their legs. Just that one position, for me, just to focus and teach what I think are, let's say, the top 5 fundamental principles for that position in 2 hours is too hard. I never got a chance to really dive deep into any particular subject with the students. So it was fun, and I was giving them a lot of information, and it was all useful. I like to think functional material, but I never, as a coach, really got to feel like the student left my class, and when they left my class at the end of that day or at the end of the weekend, there was a measurable empirical improvement in what they were doing that you could test and see, because I just didn't have enough time. So I decided, I think it was 4 years ago, instead of doing that, I'm going to pick one thing. And the first one I picked was low mount. And I'm just going to do one weekend, and that's all we're going to talk about is low mount top. I'm not going to talk about escapes. I'm not going to talk about middle mount or high mount. All we're going to do is just work that. We'll have one side try and hold and one side try and escape Saturday morning and measure what happens. And then we're going to have one side try and hold and one side try and escape Sunday evening or afternoon when we're done, and measure our progress. And in that 2 days, all I'm going to try and do is get every student on the mat to be able to perform better by focusing solely on the fundamentals. And it turned out well, because for the first time ever, I felt like I was really able to dive into one subject and do it justice. Even there, it feels like such a short time, but at least I felt like I was able to do the topic some justice. And from a more selfish standpoint, I found myself as a coach and as an instructor learn so much from that process, because when you teach something over and over, what happens is every seminar would get a little better. I would see the things that didn't work quite as well for the students, and other things that the students did, pick up quicker. Different ways to express things, different order in which to present the material often makes quite a bit of difference. Different problems would arise, different places I would go, different people would have different escapes or different creative things they would do that would require problem solving. So by the time I get to the end of the year, I myself felt like I was beginning to really get a much better handle on the position as well. So I've stuck with that format ever since, and I really enjoy doing it that way.
Sounds like a really interesting approach. an effective one. I mean, you're really digging a deep hole of knowledge. And one of the biggest complaints I hear from people about seminars in general is that, it's kind of a shotgun. You have so much information and it's kind of all over the place and you don't really retain a whole lot. You might go there just for the experience or just because you like who's putting it on or whatever. But it sounds like this approach would really be beneficial for you to be able to really gain deeper insight and be able to retain that.
Yeah, and like I said, we measure it. So the students will, they'll pick somebody that's a good match for them, close to their weight and belt level. They'll start with something like, if we're doing low mount, one side hold using only low mount, one side try and escape. And then at the end of the day, the end of that Saturday, it's usually 2 to 3 hours, 4 hours later, we'll do the exact same thing. And pretty much without exception, everybody in the room is doing much better after that one afternoon than they did in the morning. And so one of the valuable things I think that teaching method brings out in the students is it lets people know, hey, if you really apply some intelligence to what you're doing and you focus on one topic for a while and isolate it, which is exactly what Rickson's talked about forever, you can make a big difference in your own game in just one day, one training session, 2 hours. You can actually see a marked improvement in your ability to deal with another human being who's resisting 100%. And I think that's a positive message for the students because it lets the students know that they can do it. It gives them a sense of confidence and hopefully gives them an approach that they can apply without me ever being there to every other problem that will arise for them in their career in jiu-jitsu.
Love it. Love it. Sounds very practical. Let's change gears for a minute. And I know you like to read books and kind of follow your posts on what books you're reading. But if you looked over the last 12 months, what would you say is the most interesting book you've read and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the best book I read, the one that I found the most interesting in 2019 was the Thomas Sowell book, Discrimination and Disparity.
Yes.
And the reason why I found that book so interesting is because of Professor Sowell's just logic and his thinking process. So the book is basically his argument, and he breaks it down step by step in a way that even a layman like myself can follow. And I love clear thinking and rational thought, pretty much regardless of the topic. So that's one of those books where the first time I read it, I highlighted just about every page and dog-eared every other page. And then I read it once or twice more just so I fully understood the principles. So I think for 2019, that was probably my favorite pick.
Are there any main points that stick out that you can share?
I think the big point... So
start off by tell us a little bit who, for those that don't know Thomas Sowell. I'm actually a big fan of his too, but tell us a little bit about who he is and then more about the book.
Sure. I'm not going to be able to do his biography justice, but he's a longtime economics professor and writer. You can go back and see videos on YouTube of him having conversations back in the 70s on firing line with William Buckley and arguing with people about different subjects back then. He's always very thoughtful, very sharp in his application of reasoning, which I appreciate. And I've enjoyed many of his books. So this is his latest. It's not too big. And the big takeaway for me was if you really want to find out the truth of any particular topic, of course you have to ask yourself, how could I be wrong? And then you have to control for all these different things. So if we say, for example, every disparity in outcome must therefore be a result of discrimination, it makes it virtually impossible for us to ever find where real discrimination exists, which of course all of us want to find, because where actual discrimination exists, we don't want it to exist. But how do you know unless you control for all the other factors that could possibly show that that's not what it is? And that in a nutshell, that's the logic behind it. And he breaks down how, and then how you can look at the data and separate out the data in such a way that you really can get to some empirical answers. And that's what I think. He's also just such a great writer. He's a very clear writer. One of my other favorite writers is Sam Harris, and the thing I like about Sam's writing is just how clear it is. It's so, each sentence is written in nothing is wasted. It's written in such a simple way where the person is actually trying to make themselves understood. So, a lot of times I'll read different things from different academics, and it's almost as if they're writing in such a way as that they don't want to be understood. Right. And I understand that in any given field there's their own language, their own lingo, but even beyond the terminology, I think that happens quite often. And so for me, the sign of somebody who has a lot of confidence in their argument and in what they're saying is the fact that they will write it out in such a way that they're trying as hard as they can to make themselves understood, which I always appreciate.
Yeah, I do too. There's obviously a lot of intelligent people out there, and they can write to that higher level, and other PhDs or whatever or learned people may understand it, but the average person won't. And I love someone who's really very articulate and insightful like Tom Vassell, but can really break it down and make it understandable. And I think he's 80-something years old right now, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure how old he is, but
he's been around a while, but very interesting guy.
Absolutely, yeah.
I actually read this book, or got it on audio after you posted it, because I was familiar with him a little, and then when I heard of that one, I said I got to check that out. So it's definitely a good read.
Yeah, it's a good. You enjoyed it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've gone to YouTube and watched a lot of his videos.
Excellent. Yeah.
So, is there anything that you can share that people might be surprised to know about you, Matt? Are you an open book, or there's some things that you can share, but maybe it isn't common knowledge?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've been asked that one before. No, I think I'm pretty much an open book. I have 5 kids, three of which are still at home with me: a 2-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 9-year-old, and 10 now. And my kids and my wife are the majority of my life, so I'm pretty boring that way. And beyond that, I enjoy writing and reading, and then traveling and doing my seminars when we don't have this virus to contend with, and spending time with my students here at home. So I'm not too complicated in that sense.
Back up a little. I know the last 3 you said were at home and young. What about the oldest children? How old are they?
Yeah, I have 2 older boys from my previous marriage. They are 23 and 25. They're out of the house, of course, doing their thing. How
does fatherhood, as you get older, you have a few years, a little seasoned like myself now, but you still have younger kids. So how is fatherhood now compared to when you were younger?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's very different. So when I was a young man, my first marriage, my 2 boys, I was 21, 24. I think I was 24 when my first son was born. And I was just starting, within the first year or so of starting my first gym, and didn't come from any money. I don't have any money. Was completely on my own. And so I was working full time and graveyard shift, and then teaching classes 6 days a week, returning all the calls, doing all the stuff that all of us that started gyms, most of us had to do. And so I was very busy, long story short. So from 24 through my mid-30s, my focus really was on my career. And I tried to be a good dad and spend as much time with my young kids as possible, but I had a lot less time, number one. And number two, I think when you're that age, I certainly speak for myself, I didn't appreciate the fact that, once that time is gone, that time is gone, and you don't get that time back with your kids. And so now that I had kids older, when my daughter Annika was born, I would have been 41 or something. I had a very different take on it. I knew how valuable that time was. I didn't want to lose that time with my daughter, and I was in a somewhat better financial position, so I could stay home, maybe work 6 or 8 hours a day and be able to spend time with my kids. So I'm in a better position to be able to spend time with them, and I'm in a much better headspace in terms of understanding the value of that time. So I think that's the big difference.
That's great. I can definitely relate to that. I was 41 when I had my son, Christian, who's 15, and I also have a daughter, Anna, who will be 12 this summer. And I'm really glad that I had them later, and it got a chance to get kind of the craziness out, so the wild oats, and really be more mature and present and appreciative of that opportunity and what I really have with that. So,
yeah, absolutely.
All right, last question. I want to respect your time, so just want to ask you, so when you look back over your life and everything you've done and accomplished, Matt, what are you the most proud of?
What am I the most proud of? That's a good question. I'm the most proud of my kids and my family. And second to that, I think I'm most proud of the men and women that we have that make up SBG, the type of people that we have, the quality of people that we have. Being able to play some role in that association, I think, is probably the thing that I'm most proud of after, of course, my family.
Wonderful. Well, you've certainly touched a lot of lives and impacted a lot of lives throughout the world. So hats off to you, man. I appreciate your time and letting us get to know you a little more. And thanks for what you do, man. Keep doing it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right. Really enjoyed that conversation with Matt. What a really interesting guy he is. All right, if you haven't checked out the Breathing for BJJ program, check it out today. The Breathing for BJJ program is an incredible program based on the work of Dr. Belisa Vranich, breathing expert and author of the books Breathe and Breathing for Warriors, as well as draws on the insights from some of the top Jiu Jitsu and MMA coaches today, such as Pedro Sauer, Mike Bidwell, Salo Ribeiro, Greg Nelson, and Henry Akins. The program's guaranteed to take your breathing to the next level on the mat and increase your functional capacity to breathe. It will also help you become less stressed and anxious when in difficult and challenging situations and positions. So check it out today at www.breathingforbjj.com. Up next is the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment. All right, time now for the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment. Today I'll be featuring a post from Robert Van Valkenburg and Holistic Budo in his blog, and it's called The Dividing Line Between Success and Failure. Some of the world's greatest innovations were born out of necessity and limited resources. Limitations do not have to be seen as restrictive boundaries within which we are stuck and unable to escape. With a shift in mindset away from hopelessness and toward creative solutions, our limitations, whether they be time, tools, or resources, actually become our muse, the source from which our inspiration arises. By accepting our limitations, we give ourselves permission to harness them to our advantage instead of being bound by them in our detriment. When necessity demands that we act, either for our physical survival or our existential fulfillment, we must take stock of the time, tools, and resources we have at our disposal and determine how to best use these to achieve our goals. What we have may be all that we get. This may be the palette from which we must paint our masterpiece. In reality, the difference between a novice and an expert is not the materials one or the other has at his or her disposal, but the way that they are utilized and to what effect. This dividing line between success and failure is drawn by creativity. It is our ability to bring creative solutions to the table and to execute them in spite of our limitations, whether natural or circumstantial, that determines our usefulness and service to both our community and to our ideas themselves. So, great stuff. Holistic Budo, check it out on social media. And that's going to do it for this edition of the show. As always, I thank you for listening. Hope you're enjoying the show. If you feel like you're benefiting from the show and want to show your support, you can support us on our Patreon page and a link in the show notes. Please like and follow us on social media and help us spread the word by reposting our posts and telling others about the show. You can leave comments on the website at www.graciejujitsurocks.com. You can also go to iTunes and leave comments as well as rate the show, and we would appreciate a 5-star rating, which helps us with our standing in iTunes. You can also leave comments on our YouTube channel. If you have suggestions for the show, please don't hesitate to give those. We always like feedback and suggestions. Okay, that's going to do it. So until next time, this is Marty Josie, and I'll see you on the mat.